The cold steel of the evidence table. The fMRI is still warming up under the desk lamp. 3 regions of the human brain. One decides if a life is taken. The other 2 decide if it's protected. Which one is yours? The Dunedin longitudinal study tracked 1,037 children for 32 years. By age 3, they could predict with 78% accuracy who would end up violent. The predictor wasn't socioeconomic status, it wasn't trauma. It was a single neurological threshold, measurable before the child could form a complete sentence. The same lab later found that threshold exists in protectors too. The difference is where the activation breaks. You've been told that killers lack a conscience, that protectors have an excess of it. The fMRI data from Kent Keel's lab at the Mind Research Network says something else entirely. The conscience isn't missing in a killer's brain. It's hyperactive in a specific region, and that overactivation is what triggers the impulse cycle, not the break. Here's what the scan reveals. The amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex. 3 regions, 1 flashpoint. The amygdala registers threat. The prefrontal cortex applies context. The anterior cingulate mediates the conflict between them. In a protector's brain, the amygdala signals danger. The prefrontal cortex assesses, is this threat real or perceived? The anterior cingulate modulates the response, allowing a controlled reaction. The impulse cycle has a latency period. A break exists between detection and action. In a killer's brain, that latency is compressed or reversed. The amygdala fires, but the prefrontal cortex doesn't apply context. It amplifies the threat signal, and the anterior cingulate, instead of mediating, overrides the inhibition mechanism entirely. The impulse cycle bypasses the break. The threshold for violence lowers. If you've ever wondered what your own latency looks like, whether your brain amplifies or applies context, that's exactly the question the scan leaves open. Subscribe to keep reading these wiring diagrams before the headlines distort them. And in the comments, drop 1 word, the region you suspect might be overactive in your own impulse cycle, amygdala, prefrontal, or cingulate. But the scan doesn't stop there. The same 3 regions in a protector's brain show a different pattern under stress. Not a lack of activation, but a specific wiring of the reward ratio. The protector's brain not only detects threat, it anticipates it, and the anticipation triggers a dopamine response tied to the act of intervention. The protector's impulse cycle isn't about suppressing violence, it's about redirecting it into a controlled, protective channel. That redirection is the hidden mechanism. And it's measurable. James Blair's violence inhibition mechanism model at the National Institute of Mental Health documented this exact pattern in studies of combat veterans and emergency responders. The amygdala in a protector shows a lower baseline activation for threat detection, but a higher activation for harm prevention. The anterior cingulate doesn't just mediate, it actively inhibits the impulsive response and recruits the prefrontal cortex for a strategic, protective action. The killer's brain, by contrast, shows a higher baseline activation in the amygdala for perceived threat, even in neutral contexts. The prefrontal cortex doesn't inhibit. It elaborates the threat into a justification for action. The anterior cingulate fails to mediate, and the impulse cycle completes without a break. This isn't a moral judgment, it's a wiring diagram. The Dunedin study found that the children who became violent had a specific pattern of amygdala reactivity at age 3. The same children who became protectors, police officers, firefighters, social workers, had a different pattern. The amygdala reactivity was present in both groups. The difference was in the connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. In the protectors, that connectivity strengthened over time. In the killers, it degraded. The question isn't whether you have the wiring for violence. Everyone does. The question is whether the break exists and whether it engages at the right threshold. Think about that for a second. The same 3 regions exist in every human brain. The difference between a first responder who runs into a collapsing building and a serial offender who stalks a victim is not the presence of violence. It's the latency of the impulse cycle. the time between detection and action. And that latency is trained or not by the environment before the brain fully matures. The Dunedin study tracked the same children from age 3 to age 35. The ones who became protectors weren't the ones who never felt aggression. They were the ones who learned before age 7 that aggression required a delay, a pause, a threshold check. The ones who became killers learned that aggression was the immediate solution, no latency, no break. The fMRI doesn't show evil. It shows a broken circuit that was never wired in the first place. But here's where the data breaks the narrative. The Dunedin study also found that some children from abusive environments became protectors, not killers. The same trauma that wires one brain for violence wires another for intervention. The difference wasn't the trauma itself. It was the presence of a single protective factor, a caregiver who modeled delayed response to threat. The child who saw a parent pause before reacting learned that the impulse cycle has a break. The child who saw immediate, explosive reaction learned that the impulse cycle is the only option. The threshold isn't fixed at birth. It's trained. And this changes how you read every crime headline that follows. When you see a case of a first responder who saved dozens, you're not seeing a person without violence. You're seeing a person whose wiring was trained to delay the impulse cycle, redirect it, and use it for protection. When you see a case of a serial offender, you're not seeing a person with evil. You're seeing a person whose wiring was trained to skip the delay entirely. The same three regions. The same biological hardware, different training. And the training happens in the first 7 years of life, before the prefrontal cortex fully myelinates, before the child has any conscious choice in the matter. This is the kind of data that rewires how you read a case file, but only if you're building the full map. Subscribe to stay inside the investigation as we trace these circuits across more cases, more scans, and more thresholds. And in the comments, finish this sentence. The protector's break was trained by... If this made sense instantly, it's because you already knew. Some people hear this and ignore it. You're not that person. You've felt the discomfort when a headline uses the word evil as an explanation. You've known that the explanation was incomplete. You've wanted the data beneath the judgment. Here's what the data says. The three regions are the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex. The amygdala scans for threat. The prefrontal cortex applies context. The anterior cingulate mediates the response. In a killer's brain, the amygdala is hyperactive to neutral stimuli. The prefrontal cortex amplifies that threat signal instead of applying context. The anterior cingulate fails to inhibit the impulse cycle. The result is a compressed latency between detection and violence. In a protector's brain, the amygdala has a lower baseline reactivity. The prefrontal cortex applies context and activates the inhibition mechanism. The anterior cingulate recruits the prefrontal cortex for controlled protective action. The impulse cycle has a full latency period. The break engages, the same wiring diagram, different calibration, but the scan doesn't stop there. The reward ratio is the hidden variable. In a killer's brain, the dopamine response spikes at the moment of aggression. The act of violence itself becomes the reward. In a protector's brain, the dopamine response spikes at the moment of successful intervention. The reward is not the violence. It's the prevention of harm. The same neural circuitry, different reward target. And this is where the wiring breaks differently for killers than for protectors. The killer's brain learns that aggression produces a dopamine reward. The protector's brain learns that intervention produces a dopamine reward. Both are learning. Both are rewarding. The difference is the target, which raises a question the archives don't want you to find. If both patterns are learned and the learning happens before age 7, then what does that mean for the justice system? The justice system judges the act. It assumes the adult chose the violence. But the wiring for that choice was laid down before the child had language, before the child had a sense of self, before the child could be held responsible for anything. The fMRI doesn't absolve, it explains. And explanation is more disturbing than judgment, because judgment allows you to look away. Explanation demands you look at the mechanism. The mechanism is not evil. It's a broken circuit that was never trained to delay. You've seen this in headlines your whole life. A first responder saves a child from a burning building. A serial offender stalks a victim for weeks. Both have the same three brain regions. Both have the same biological hardware for threat detection and response. The difference is not the presence of violence. It's the training of the delay. And this is where the parallel narrative breaks open. The ancient executioner had the same wiring as the modern shooter. The Roman soldier training manuals from Livy's Ab Urbe Condita describe a specific method for suppressing the killing impulse, a pause between detection and action. The soldier was trained to hold the weapon steady for 3 seconds before striking. The brain learned the delay. The brake was strengthened. The modern gang member learns the opposite. The reward ratio is trained by immediate response. No pause, no delay. The impulse cycle completes instantly. The same 3 regions. Different training, and the training is not genetic, it's environmental. It's the caregiver who models delay or explosion. It's the neighborhood that rewards immediate aggression or delayed response. It's the first 7 years of life before the prefrontal cortex is fully developed. If you've ever read a crime headline and felt the justice system just doesn't make sense, you know that uneasy feeling of randomness, of wanting to see the data behind the verdict. The data is here. The data is in the 3 regions. The data is in the latency of the impulse cycle. And the data says the timing of aggression is the real variable. The killer doesn't have a different brain. The killer has a brain that was trained to complete the impulse cycle without delay. The protector has the same brain trained to delay, redirect, and choose the intervention over the aggression. The same wiring, different training, different threshold, and the threshold is biological. It's measurable. It's visible on an fMRI. The scan reveals that the anterior cingulate cortex in a protector shows higher activity during the latency period between threat detection and response. The killer's anterior cingulate shows lower activity during the same period. The inhibition mechanism isn't absent in the killer. It's just not engaged. The brake exists. It's just not applied. And this changes how you read every case that follows. When you hear about a protector who saved dozens, you're not hearing about a saint. You're hearing about a person whose brain was trained to apply the brake. When you hear about a killer, you're not hearing about a monster. You're hearing about a person whose brain was never trained to apply the brake. The 3 regions aren't a moral judgment. They're a biological threshold, and the threshold can be shifted. The Dunedin study found that children who received intervention, specifically training in delayed response to threat, showed measurable changes in the connectivity between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex by age 10. The same children who were at risk for violence became protectors, their brains rewired. The wiring is not destiny. It's training. And the training can change, but the justice system continues to judge the adult without understanding the 7-year-old who trained the wiring. The criminal justice system assumes choice. The neurological data shows a system that learned to skip the delay. If you want to understand the evidence before society catches up, stay with this. The scan doesn't just explain one killer, it predicts the next one, and the one after that. The threshold is measurable before the violence occurs. The latency is visible on the fMRI before the act. We've known for a decade what to look for, but we keep pretending it's a moral choice, not a neurological lesion. The lesion is the training. The training is the delay or the lack of it. The 3 regions are the same in every human brain. The difference is not the anatomy, it's the conditioning, and the conditioning was done by the first 7 years of life. This is not an excuse. It's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be understood, intervened on, and shifted. But the first step is seeing the wiring. This is the moment where the viewer either walks away with a headline or stays to audit the full circuit. Subscribe to keep tracing these lesions across case files, scans, and thresholds that the justice system refuses to see. And in the comments, write the one factor from your own first 7 years that you think trained your delay or your lack of it. That data point belongs to you. You've seen the headlines, you've read the case files, you felt the unease when the explanation is evil. Now you have the data, now you see the three regions. Now you understand the latency. The next step is asking, what else are we ignoring?